Hello and welcome to episode 40 of the Fertility Rewire podcast. I'm talking this week about something that I see an awful lot in my practice and is a really big client group that I work with, and that is secondary fertility issues. So already having a child and trying to have another child, whether or not you had difficulty conceiving the first. And there are many physical and emotional factors at play here, and I just want to start to introduce some of those as an area for discussion. So I'm putting this together and putting this out in the last week of November 2020 when you're listening to this. And something really, really exciting happening next week on the 2nd of December 2020 at 6 o'clock UK time is that I will be hosting a webinar with MIRA Fertility. And I'm going to be talking about how to reduce your trying to conceive stress and boost your fertility. If you've listened to me before, you'll know that's a subject that I am extremely passionate about, and there will be mention of tigers. So the link for that webinar will be in the show notes. It's also on my Instagram link at Fertility Rewire. If you want any more information about that, then drop us a line as ever. But I really, really hope you enjoyed this episode, and whether you're trying for your first baby or your second or third baby, there are some key areas that I think that will be of interest. All right, enjoy. Hello and welcome to the Fertility Rewire podcast, a place for information and discussion around topics relevant to fertility. I'm your host, Kat Stevens. I'm a fertility coach and founder of the Fertility Rewire program. And I'm passionate about people being given sufficient information to enhance their own fertility awareness. I'm going to talk this week on the podcast about something that I see a lot of in terms of the couples that I'm working with. Now I get calls, the free discovery call, from many people who are experiencing issues regarding getting pregnant. And in terms of the couples or the individuals that I work with the most, I would say that they fall into this category, and that category is when trying for a second baby. Now, it's not that there are more people who are trying for a second baby or seeking help, but I think there are much more people within that group trying for a second baby who are looking outside of conventional assisted fertility treatments. Now, that is due to a number of issues, but primarily I tend to find that it's due to the financial implications of that. Now, what you may not know, and I see this featured in many articles, is that it's estimated that a quarter of all couples seeking fertility treatment are already parents. But what I find more interesting, that of the couples, not that quarter, of couples who are trying to get pregnant again, who are trying to conceive their second child, only half of them are likely to seek treatment. And again, that comes down hugely to fertility treatment costs, or that people don't want to go down that route, but also that, is there a real emotional issue? And I say, is there? I'm asking that to you. I know that there is. That there is this idea that, well, we've had one child, we should be happy. And there can be a real guilt around wanting a second child. And this plays out a lot in terms of people I speak to who maybe are in Facebook groups or on forums, and they're wanting a second baby. But because they're aware of that same anguish and feeling, but coming from people who are trying for their first baby, there is that overwhelming guilt and that overwhelming feeling that they should be happy with one. And whichever side you're on here, whether you're trying for your first baby or you are trying for a second or maybe even a third baby, you may have a different view on that. If you are not pregnant yet yourself, you might think, well, you've got one child already. But remember that when you're trying for a second baby, you may have been in that position with your first, and you may have thought at that time, I'll just be happy, I'll be content with one. But there are so many other issues that come into play here. The biggest one is that when you're trying to get pregnant with your second child, you are not really trying for a baby. It becomes very different. You are trying for a sibling, and it is that real desire and need, if you like, to provide a sibling for your child, because you feel so terrible that you are not providing this for them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little while, but I wanted just to look at some of the physical factors related to trying to get pregnant with your second child. Now, obviously, many of them are the same as if you're trying for your first baby. So you've got the issue of nutritional aspects, and we know how some key nutrition can affect your hormonal balance and imbalance. And in particular, we're potentially looking at that progesterone support in the second half of the cycle. We're looking at egg and sperm quality. You will have heard me talk in previous podcast episodes, and if not, if this is your first time to me, hello, and have a look at the previous episodes. The testing is not sufficient. Having a normal test, I'm doing inverted commas with my hand, does not mean that the egg and sperm are of sufficient health to enable pregnancy. We need to go deeper into that. And in the clients I'm working with, I'm finding massive improvement in fertility outcomes, changes in cycles, but certainly in terms of pregnancy when we are addressing that factor specifically. Then when we come on to pelvic congestion, which I've spoken about in previous episodes, changes can happen during your previous pregnancies. Changes can happen if you've been pregnant and experienced loss. Changes can happen if you have been pregnant and given birth to a child. Now, there can be huge factors relating to potential scarring or positioning of the uterus. Everything does get a bit shifted around. Things that affect the uterus and the reproductive system after that first pregnancy can be really, really key. The emotional factors. So we talk about not just relaxing, I know that, but we do have to talk about stress, and we do talk about the effect of cortisol on progesterone. And this becomes really, really key with the second, because yes, you've got fertility stress, but you tend to be quite a lot busier. You might be juggling childcare commitments, work commitments, household commitments. There might be financial implications on you. So that's a really huge issue. Also sleep. I've spoken in previous episodes about sleep and how that affects your or can affect your fertility in terms of the sleep quality. So if you have a child that is still waking you in the night, if you're having early morning waking due to your child waking early, if your child is teething or other issues are occurring, then that can be a huge factor in terms of your fertility. The thing that I see more and more, pretty much in I would say everybody who comes to see me when they are experiencing secondary fertility issues that have been deemed unexplained, I see a short luteal phase. I would say I see that in everybody. I see a short luteal phase, and that is something that we always work on. The other issue is, if you are, you started your family and then you're trying for a second baby, your age may be an issue. You're getting older. And actually the worry about the fact that you are older can sometimes be the biggest impact on your fertility rather than the age itself. Because we know women over 35, and I'm in that bracket, I had my two at 38 and 39, and over 40 can get pregnant. We know that. And more likely in many cases, accidentally. that is possible. But when you are thinking that it is going to be difficult, we're setting that stress in place as well. Key things to consider are emotional trauma. So what did you experience during your first pregnancy? What were the emotional implications there? And if you had quite a journey on your first pregnancy, you might not have got pregnant easily with your first. It might have been a long, hard slog yourself. You might have been on a long fertility journey. I'm working with a couple at the moment. We're just coming towards the end of our time together. And, we were chatting about trying to conceive. And, I've talked about the timing of sex and how baby sex is very different. And there's an episode about that too. But they realised that of the 8 years that they had been having sex, 6 of those had been spent trying to conceive. That's huge. That is so big. And that affects the sexual relationship at other times in the cycle, other times in the month as well. So there's huge emotional trauma there. It might be that you had a difficult journey the first time and then you're coming into thinking about having another child, and already you're thinking that this is going to be difficult. Already there is that stress in place, that emotional response, that cortisol that's affecting progesterone, remember we've talked about before, but it's also affecting testosterone. So it's affecting libido and it's affecting sperm production as well. So it's so important to consider these key emotional traumas. When we come on to the birth itself, what was that like? When you think back to the birth of your first child, and if you can, if you're not driving or busy doing something else, close your eyes. Just remember the birth. And does that cause distress? And if you were to scale, score that stress from 0 to 10, with 0 being no distress at all and 10 being the worst distress you could imagine, where on that scale do you think you fit in terms of that? Because if it is over 2, then that would signify to me that there is emotional trauma related to that birth. And a big part of the work that I do with couples when we're looking at secondary fertility, and I say couples because this can be an impact on both sides, I work with that birth trauma. So I'm a birth trauma practitioner as well. And the reason I trained as a birth trauma practitioner was because of this issue of the couples I was working with secondary fertility issues, that was a huge emotional block. And we know that there is increasing evidence about the emotional trauma and previous emotion and the impact that is held on the body. And it's not that you're consciously necessarily thinking about that, but that is a real key issue. So if I come back to this point about wanting a sibling, when you are trying to get pregnant, you are longing for a child. You are longing to be a parent. You see that family unit. It's perhaps something you've always thought about, and it becomes something that seems increasingly unattainable, and the stress is huge. And then we have the emotional impact that might be affecting fertility, and then we have fertility itself affecting the emotional impact and effect. It's a huge vicious circle. But when you're trying for a second baby, this becomes, as I've said, about longing for a sibling. And it's not just about longing for a sibling for the here and now. It is about your child and not leaving your child alone in the future. You tend to trip on to when you're not here anymore. So if you're not here anymore, what will that be like for your child if they're an only child? And you have images in your head of perhaps them having children and those children being cousins. It's amazing how your mind will take you forward like that. And it's so hard to get your head round if you don't have a child already. And you may have struggled to get pregnant with your first child, and at that time you may have seen people talking about difficulty getting pregnant with a second and thought, well, why are they worried about that? I can't get pregnant with my first. You very much focus on where you're at, and that springs over to then when you are trying to get pregnant with your second, and you're saying to yourself, we should be happy, we've got one child, let's just be happy with one child. Other people don't have one child. We're incredibly lucky to be in this position. But is about a sibling. It's a really, really important factor, and it's so hard to get your head around that unless you are in that position yourself. So I wanted to draw attention to this aspect of secondary fertility. And if you are listening to this and you are trying to get pregnant with your first child, there are still key aspects in this episode that relate to you as well, in terms of those physical aspects and those emotional aspects. And I think it's hard sometimes to group everything into fertility and fertility issues, because there are so many aspects, so many nuances of, yes, physical changes and physical effects of whether there's a diagnosis, which again, you'll have heard me talk about before, that even if you've been told your fertility issues are down to endometriosis or PCOS, that is not a diagnosis of fertility issues. And also, it shouldn't be the thing that stops us looking at other aspects as well. But this is when we come to this unexplained aspect. Particularly, that is what I am seeing in the clients that I'm working with, or have been working with over the past 8 or so years. And I see great successes in this group of secondary fertility. I just feel it's hugely overlooked, and there isn't always a lot of sympathy and compassion towards this group. And sometimes that lack of sympathy and compassion comes from yourself. You want to have a sibling for your child, but you're feeling guilty that you should be happy with one. And that, in effect, is a huge factor on the fertility itself. I have barely brushed the surface with that, but what I will do is I will share over the next few weeks or so a case study, and I will talk through what the presenting factors were, what we did with a couple that I worked with recently who are now 29 weeks pregnant, which is fantastic. And they were all set to spend £11,000 on an IVF program here in the UK because they saw that as their only option. But they worked with me for 3 months and they are pregnant. And it's interesting because I'm also a hypnobirthing instructor, and I don't do that now in terms of classes because my focus is on my fertility business, fertility work, completely really there. But every so often a couple ask me if I will do a hypnobirthing. It's a mindful mama hypnobirthing. If I will do that with them because they're used to working with me and they're used to the sound of my voice in other exercises and practices that we've done. And I just worked with the female within this couple. Obviously the male partner made changes in terms of what he was doing and his supplements and practice and acupressure work and things like that. All of that he did, and he did willingly, but I'd never met him on a call before. So when we started the session and, we said hello, his first thing he said to me was, "Thanks for getting us pregnant," which is such a beautiful thing to hear. And then obviously, quickly, I said, well, no, I pointed you in the right direction. I think that was down to you. So it was just, it's a beautiful time to be with them, having got pregnant. And I want you to see that as a possibility. And I want you to see that as hope. And I want you to accept that it's okay to want a second child. And I want you to accept that there is an answer, and possibly those real key emotional factors are making a big difference, particularly on your luteal phase, but also there are other ways that we can work with that as well. So as ever, if you wanted to book a chat with me, if you wanted to find out more, then you can access the link in the notes, and I'd love to chat with you. Be great. All right then, take care as ever. Thanks so much for listening to this episode, and I really hope that you enjoyed it, and perhaps even it provoked some thoughts. And what I really want to convey through these podcasts is that through information and exploration, we can achieve transformation. And perhaps it's time to tame your fertility tigers. As ever, if you want any further information, or you'd like to get in touch or give your feedback, then please do get in touch. You can find me at fertilityrewire.com and also at Fertility Rewire on Instagram and Facebook. And then online resources are also available at fertilityrewire.com.